They said it was just a routine inspection. A safety check, they called it. I let them in. I watched them walk through my home like it was theirs. Smiles, clipboards, polite nods. And then they left. But something stayed behind. Not them, not their tools, not their paperwork. What stayed was a silence. The kind that creeps in when something's missing. Not just objects. Trust, control, certainty. So I ask you, when the people who promise protection leave you feeling violated, is that just bad luck? Or is it something deeper? Something systemic? Something we're trained not to see? They didn't knock like strangers. They arrived like a ritual. HOA-branded polos, laminated badges, and the kind of practice politeness that makes you question your own suspicion. I opened the door because I was supposed to, because the handbook said I should, because the culture of compliance whispers that resistance is rude, and rudeness is rebellion. They called it a safety inspection, but the word safety fell hollow, like a balloon filled with smoke. I watched them step inside, their shoes brushing against the threshold like it was a border they'd already crossed in their minds. They didn't ask if I felt safe. They didn't ask if I wanted them there. They asked where the fuse box was, where the fire extinguisher lived, where the smoke detector slept. And I answered like a good resident, like someone who believed that order was protection. But something felt off, not loud, not obvious, just off, like a painting slightly crooked on the wall, like a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I told myself it was nothing. That discomfort is just the price of community. That privacy is flexible when the greater good is at stake. But is it? Is it really? Because when they walked through my hallway, they didn't just observe, they scanned. Their eyes didn't linger on safety hazards. They lingered on my bookshelf, on my camera gear, on the drawer I forgot to close. And I felt it, that subtle shift from inspection to inventory. I wanted to speak, to ask why they were looking there, but the words felt treasonous. After all, they were here to help, weren't they? That's what the HOA promises. Oversight, not overreach. But promises are just words until they're broken. And when they left, the silence was louder than their footsteps. I stood in my living room, staring at the space they'd occupied, and something inside me whispered, check your things. Not because I suspected theft. Not yet, but because I felt invaded, not violently, not visibly, but spiritually. Like someone had touched the inside of my mind without permission. I checked the drawer. The camera lens was gone. I checked the shelf. A signed book missing. I checked the closet. A box of documents. Disturbed. And suddenly, the word inspection felt like a euphemism. Like calling a storm weather. Like calling surveillance safety. I wanted to believe it was coincidence. That maybe I misplaced them. That maybe I was paranoid. But paranoia is just pattern recognition without proof. And the pattern was forming. They came in with smiles. They left with silence. And I was left with questions. Not just about what was missing, but about what I'd given away. My trust, my autonomy, my illusion of control. And maybe that's the real theft. Not the objects, but the belief that I was ever truly safe. They say oversight is protection. That rules are scaffolding of safety. That when the HOA walks through your door, clipboard in hand, they're not invading, they're ensuring. But what happens when the scaffolding becomes a cage? When the rule stops serving you and starts surveilling you? I used to believe in structure, in the idea that a well-run neighborhood was a sign of civilization, that the HOA was a necessary organ in the body of community. But organs can become tumors, and tumors don't ask permission. They grow, quietly, systematically. I started reading the bylaws after they left, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. I needed to understand what I'd agreed to, what I'd signed away in the name of safety, and what I found wasn't comfort. It was language, dense, bureaucratic, and disturbingly vague. Phrases like reasonable access, routine inspection, community standards. But who defines reasonable? Who decides what's routine? Who sets the standard? Because when power wears a costume of policy, it becomes harder to see, harder to name, harder to resist. I realized that the HOA didn't need my permission. They had my compliance. Not because I gave it freely, but because I didn't know I could say no. That's how systems work. They don't demand obedience. They design it. They embed it in the architecture of expectation. And expectation is the most invisible form of control. I thought about Foucault, about panopticons, and the internalization of surveillance, about how we police ourselves when we think we're being watched. And I wondered, was this inspection about safety? Or was it about reminding me who holds the keys? Because when someone walks through your home under the banner of oversight, they're not just checking fire alarms. They're asserting dominance. They're mapping your space. They're measuring your compliance. I looked at the checklist they left behind. It had boxes ticked, notes scribbled, and the final line, no violations. But something about that phrase felt sinister, like a warning disguised as praise, like a reminder that next time they might not be so lenient. I started noticing things in the neighborhood. Cameras on lampposts, notices about lawn length, fines for faded paint. And I realized this wasn't community. It was choreography, a dance of conformity, orchestrated by invisible hands. And every step out of line was met with correction, not conversation, not compassion, just correction. I thought about the missing items again, about how easily they could be dismissed. No evidence, they'd say, no proof. But absence is its own kind of evidence, and silence is its own kind of scream. I began to see the HOA not as a body of neighbors, but as a mechanism, a system designed to maintain order, not justice, to enforce sameness, not safety. And I wondered, how many other homes had been entered? How many other residents had felt that same unease? How many had stayed silent, afraid of being labeled difficult, uncooperative, paranoid? Because that's the final trick of oversight. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you question your instincts. It makes you complicit in your own surveillance. And once that seed is planted, it grows into fear, into compliance, into quiet. And maybe that's the real violation, not the missing objects, but the missing voice, the missing resistance, the missing truth. Trust is supposed to be sacred, a bridge between souls, not a contract between strangers. But in the world of HOA governance, trust is a checkbox, a procedural assumption, not an earned intimacy. I used to believe that trust was the glue of community, that when someone said, "We're just here to help," they meant it. But help, I've learned, is often a euphemism for access. And access is the currency of control. They didn't steal my trust. I gave it away, not because I wanted to, but because I was conditioned to. Conditioned to believe that questioning authority is dangerous. That suspicion is antisocial. That privacy is selfish. And so I let them in. I let them walk through my home, through my life, through my silence. And when they left, I realized something had shifted, not just in the room, in me. I started seeing trust differently, not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability, a soft spot in the armor, a door left unlocked. Because when trust is expected, it stops being a gift. It becomes a demand, a performance, a ritual of compliance. And rituals, once hollowed out, become cages. I thought about the way they smiled, the way they thanked me, the way they said, "Everything looks good." And I wondered, was that kindness? Or was it choreography? A script designed to soothe while they scanned? Because politeness is the most effective disguise for intrusion. It disarms. It pacifies. It makes you complicit in your own exposure. And I was complicit. I didn't ask questions. I didn't set boundaries. I didn't say no, because saying no felt like a violation of the social contract. But what if the contract was never mutual? I began to question the architecture of trust itself. Who benefits from it? Who defines it? Who weaponizes it? In HOA culture, trust is institutional, not interpersonal. It's embedded in bylaws, not built through relationship. And that's the danger. When institutions claim trust, they bypass accountability. They become self-referential, self-justifying, self-righteous. And the individual becomes a data point, a unit, a resident, not a person. I felt that shift in my bones. The moment I realized I wasn't a neighbor, I was a subject, a participant in a system that rewards silence and punishes dissent. And dissent, I've learned, is the first step toward reclaiming truth. I started talking to other residents. Quietly, carefully, and the stories began to emerge. Missing items, uncomfortable inspections, fines without explanation, and always the same refrain: I didn't want to make trouble. But trouble, I realized, is often the name we give a truth when it's inconvenient, when it disrupts the illusion, when it threatens a choreography. And I wanted to disrupt, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, because trust, once eroded, demands reckoning. It demands reflection. It demands resistance. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that things went missing, but that something deeper was stolen. The belief that I was safe because I was compliant, that I was protected because I was polite, that I was respected because I was silent. And once that belief is gone, what remains is clarity. Cold, unforgiving, liberating. Silence isn't passive. It's strategic. It's the sound of power consolidating itself in the absence of resistance. After the inspection, after the realization, after the erosion of trust, I found myself staring into a void, not of objects, but of answers. I filed a report. I asked questions. I sent emails. And what I received in return was silence, not denial, not outrage, just silence. The kind that doesn't acknowledge your existence. The kind that makes you feel like a glitch in the system. And that's when I understood silence is not neglect. It's design. It's the architecture of control. Because when institutions don't respond, they're not failing. They're asserting. They're reminding you that your voice is optional, that your discomfort is inconvenient, that your truth is incompatible with their structure. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, items, conversations. I built a timeline, not because I thought it would lead to justice, but because I needed to reclaim narrative. Because when silence becomes a dominant language, storytelling becomes rebellion. I spoke to neighbors again. Some nodded quietly. Some looked away. Some whispered, "Be careful." And that phrase, "be careful," echoed like a warning from a dystopian novel. Careful of what? Of whom? Of truth? Of consequence? I realized that silence wasn't just coming from the HOA. It was embedded in the culture, in the fear, in the choreography of compliance. And fear, I've learned, is the most effective form of governance. It doesn't need laws. It doesn't need fines. It just needs silence. I thought about Kafka, about the trial that never ends, about the man who doesn't know what he's accused of, about the system that devours without explanation. And I felt it, that same absurdity, that same helplessness, that same slow suffocation. Because when you confront a system that doesn't acknowledge your existence, you begin to question your own. You begin to wonder if your reality is valid, if your memory is accurate, if your pain is legitimate. And that's the final violation, the theft of certainty. I stood in my living room again, the same space they walked through, and I asked myself, what would happen if I made noise? If I disrupted the silence? If I refused to be careful? So I did. I posted online. I shared my story. I named names. I described the inspection, the missing items, the silence, and the response was immediate, not from the HOA, but from the algorithm. Likes, comments, shares, and buried among them a message. Same thing happened to me. And another, they took my camera. And another, I thought I was crazy. And suddenly, the silence cracked. Not shattered, just cracked. Enough to let light in. Enough to let truth breathe. And I realized silence is only powerful when it's unchallenged, when it's uninterrupted, when it's mistaken for peace. But peace without justice is just quiet oppression. And I didn't want peace. I wanted reckoning. I didn't get my items back. I didn't get an apology. But I got something else. Clarity, the kind that burns, the kind that doesn't soothe, the kind that demands action. And maybe that's the real confrontation. Not with the HOA, not with the neighbors, but with the system that taught me silence was safer than truth, that compliance was nobler than resistance, That politeness was more valuable than autonomy. And once you confront that system, you can't go back. You can't unsee. You can't unknow. You can only choose to stay quiet or to speak. And I chose to speak. Loudly, relentlessly, unapologetically. I used to believe in neighbors, in the idea that proximity breeds empathy, that shared fences meant shared values, that when something went wrong, the people closest to you would be the first to speak. But silence has a way of spreading, like mold, like smoke, like fear. After I spoke out, after I broke the choreography, I expected support, not applause, just acknowledgement, just presence. But what I got was distance, not physical, emotional, the kind that makes eye contact feel like confrontation, the kind that turns greetings into avoidance. And I realized community isn't always a sanctuary. Sometimes it's a surveillance network, a web of quiet watchers, a system of passive enforcers. I saw it in the way they looked at me, not with anger, but with caution, as if I'd become radioactive, as if truth was contagious. I saw in the way conversations shifted when I approached, in the way doors closed a little faster, in the way invitations stopped arriving. And I understood I hadn't just broken the silence. I'd broken the illusion that everything was fine, that the HOA was benevolent, that inspections were harmless, that trust was intact. And illusions, once shattered, make people uncomfortable. Because comfort is built on consistency, on predictability, on the absence of disruption. And I had become a disruption. I thought about a rent, about the banality of evil, about how systems don't need monsters to function. They just need ordinary people doing nothing, saying nothing, questioning nothing. And I saw it everywhere. In the neighbor who shrugged and said, "That's just how it works." In the one who whispered, "Don't stir the pot." In the one who said, "I had something go missing too, but I didn't want drama." And I realized complicity isn't always active. Sometimes it's passive. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it's wrapped in the language of peace. But peace without truth is just anesthesia. And I didn't want to be numb. I started seeing the HOA not as a problem, but as a symptom, the visible face of a deeper sickness. A culture that prioritizes order over justice, that rewards silence over truth, that punishes disruption more than violation. And I wondered how many of my neighbors had felt what I felt, had lost what I lost, had swallowed their discomfort to preserve the illusion, because illusions are addictive. They offer simplicity. They offer clarity. They offer the comfort of not knowing. And knowing, truly knowing, is a burden. It demands action. It demands change. It demands risk. I didn't want to be a martyr. I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to be heard, to be seen, to be believed. But belief, I've learned, is dangerous. It threatens the system. It destabilizes a choreography. It invites others to question. And questioning is the first crack in the wall. I saw that crack in a neighbor's eyes, the one who said nothing but didn't look away, the one who lingered, the one who, days later, left a note. "Thank you." No signature, no explanation, just gratitude. And maybe that's how change begins. Not with revolutions, but with whispers, with cracks, with awakenings. Truth doesn't vanish when ignored. It festers. It waits. It sharpens itself in silence. After confrontation, after the awakening, I found myself standing in the ruins of certainty, not just about the HOA, not just about the inspection, but about the entire architecture control we call community. I used to think the missing items were the story, that the theft was the climax. But theft is just a symptom. The real story is what it revealed, the machinery behind the smile, the system behind the clipboard, the ideology behind the inspection. I began to see the HOA not as a rogue actor, but as a mirror, a reflection of how we've normalized intrusion, how we've institutionalized surveillance, how we rebranded control as care. I thought about Bentham, about the panopticon, about the idea that visibility is power, that when you know you're being watched, you behave, you conform, you shrink. And I saw it everywhere, in the bylaws, in the cameras, in the inspections, in the silence. I saw it in myself, in the way I hesitated to speak, in the way I questioned my own memory, in the way I sought permission to feel violated. And I realized the real theft wasn't physical. It was psychological. It was epistemological. It was a theft of my ability to trust my own perception. And once that's gone, what remains is rawness, vulnerability, rage. But rage, I've learned, is clarifying. It burns away illusion. It exposes architecture. It demands reckoning. I started writing, not just posts, essays, letters, manifestos. I started naming the system, not just the HOA, but the culture that enables it, the culture that rewards silence, that punishes truth, that fears disruption. And I found others, not many, but enough to know I wasn't alone, enough to know the silence wasn't universal, enough to know that truth, once spoken, echoes, and echoes once heard multiply. I didn't get justice, not in the legal sense, not in the institutional sense, but I got something more dangerous, clarity, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that doesn't wait for approval, the kind that refuses to be buried. And I started asking harder questions, not just about the HOA, but about the systems we live in, the ones we call democratic, the ones we call fair, the ones we call safe. Because safety, I've learned, is often a euphemism for control. And control, once normalized, becomes invisible. I looked at my neighborhood differently, not as a collection of homes, but as a network of compliance. I saw the signs, the rules, the fines, the inspections, and I saw the people, quiet, polite, careful. And I wondered, what would happen if we all spoke? If we all named the truth? If we all refused to perform the choreography? Would the system collapse? Would the illusion shatter? Would the reckoning begin? I don't know, but I know this. Truth doesn't vanish. It waits. It sharpens. It refuses to stay buried. And when it rises, it doesn't ask for permission. It demands to be heard.